The mysterious reputation-th galaxy was home to many species who thought they ruled the stars. Alien mercenaries were among the most feared. Their reputation stretched across hundreds of worlds. For centuries they took on the toughest jobs fighting anyone willing to pay them. They were fast, sharp, and ruthless. Their name alone made entire planets tremble. But there was one name no one ever spoke lightly: Deathworld, or Special Forces, it was said. These humans were born in the most dangerous environments and grew stronger with every challenge they faced. They were survivors of the worst conditions that no other species could endure. It was rumored that no mercenary group ever survived an encounter with them, but that was just a rumor, right? A story for the weak to tell to make themselves feel safe. It was hard to believe such tales when mercenaries had faced armies of alien beasts and soldiers from across the galaxy. Still, the stories persisted. They were whispers in dark bars and quiet corners of starships where no one dared to speak too loud. Some laughed at the thought of these Deathworlders, as though they were just another challenge to be crushed underfoot. Others just shuddered and moved on, but all the while a question lingered: why were they so feared, and why had no one ever truly faced them in battle? For the crew of the Vanguard, it all started when a job came across their desks. It was simple enough as far as mercenary jobs went. The client was a wealthy businessman looking to take over a newly discovered planet full of valuable resources. But there was a catch. The planet was located on the edge of known space in a dangerous region, home to the most hostile life forms anyone had ever seen. A real death world. The client wanted protection for his operations, but none of the usual mercenary groups had dared to take the contract. When the Vanguard crew got the call, it was clear no one else had accepted either. Their reputation was built on taking impossible jobs and surviving to tell the tale. They had killed, maimed, and conquered their way through endless conflicts. But even they hesitated. The planet was crawling with aggressive fauna and deadly storms that could tear ships apart on a whim. It wasn't just dangerous, it was a death sentence for most. But that wasn't why they hesitated. No, it was the legend of the Deathworld, or Special Forces, a force of humans who lived on such planets. They didn't just survive, they thrived. They were warriors trained to fight in environments that would wipe out most other species in a single dais. The Vanguard crew gathered in their command center. The conversation was tense. No one spoke about it directly, but the fear was palpable. They all knew what the mission meant. No one had ever crossed paths with the Deathworlders and lived to tell the tale. But if they refused to take the job, their reputation would be ruined and no one would ever hire them again. After a long silence, their leader, Captain Jackson, finally broke it. He was a big man with a rough voice and an even rougher history, but even he had a rare moment of doubt. This was different. The client wanted protection against these humans, but no one knew how they operated or what to expect. He leaned forward, staring at the crew with a grim look. "You know what we're up against," he said, his voice low and steady. No one spoke, not at first. The crew had seen many things in their time, but this felt like something entirely new, something terrifying. "We've heard the stories, but there's no record of any mercenary group surviving contact with them," he continued. "If they want to fight us, it's going to be one hell of a battle. But I want to know one thing before we start. Is anyone backing down? Now's the time to say it." There was a moment of stillness before Commander Asha spoke up. She was always the calm one, the tactician, the one who looked at every angle and calculated the risks to the smallest detail. Her eyes met Jackson's with a focused intensity. "We've fought everything in this galaxy," she said, "but these Deathworlders, they're different. We've heard the stories, the way they can fight through anything and everything. No one has ever faced them and survived. But I don't know what's more dangerous, their training, or the fact that no one ever sees them coming." She paused for a moment, the silence thick enough to cut through with a knife. "But we're mercenaries," she added with a small smile. "We don't back down from a fight." The rest of the crew exchanged nervous glances, but in the end they all knew she was right. They were mercenaries. It was in their blood. They didn't shy away from a challenge. They took it head on. The fear of the Deathworlders was something they'd push aside like all the other fears that had followed them from planet to planet all the way through their years of bloodshed. So with a heavy heart and a nervous tension in the pit of their stomachs, the crew of the Vanguard made their decision. They would take the job. They would face the unknown. They would face the Deathworlder Special Forces. They prepared for departure. Captain Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that this job was going to be unlike any they had ever faced before. The legends of the Deathworlders weren't just stories, they were a warning, and now they were about to find out just how much truth was in those warnings. But there was no turning back now. They were going to find out if the stories were true, and if they were, they would face the consequences head on, no matter what. The Vanguard lifted off from their home base, heading toward the planet that had been cursed with the presence of the most terrifying soldiers in the galaxy. The crew wasn't afraid, but they couldn't help but feel the weight of the unknown bearing down on them. There was something more dangerous than what they had faced before, lurking out there waiting for them to make the wrong move. And as the ship sailed through the void of space, they couldn't escape the feeling that the real battle hadn't even begun yet. The encounter's vanguard drifted quietly through the stars, its engines hummed steady and rhythmic, but within the ship there was a palpable tension. The crew sat in silence, the looming threat of the Deathworlders hanging over them like a storm cloud. They had all heard the stories, but now they were about to face the unknown. They had no idea what awaited them on the surface of that planet. The client had briefed them on the dangers of the planet. It was a place of brutal storms, fierce creatures, and hostile terrain, the sort of place where survival meant adapting to the environment or being torn apart by it. Yet there was something else that scared them far more than the dangers of the planet. The Deathworlders, their reputation was both terrifying and mystifying. For years, they had been nothing more than a myth, a whispered legend, but now they were real, and they were waiting for the Mercenaries to land. Captain Jackson stood at the helm, staring out the viewport as the planet grew larger. His hands gripped the controls tighter than usual. His mind raced with questions. He had fought against armies of alien beasts, he had conquered planets and survived impossible odds, but nothing could prepare him for this. No one had ever survived an encounter with the Deathworlders, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to change. That he glanced at Commander Asha, who stood beside him, her expression calm, but her eyes revealed the depth of her concern. "We don't know what we're walking into," he said, his voice steady, but with a hint of uncertainty in it. "If they want to fight, we might not survive. It's one thing to fight mercenaries or aliens. It's another thing entirely to fight a species that has mastered survival itself." Asha turned to him, her expression unwavering. "We've fought everything else. This should be no different," she said. But even she couldn't deny the nagging doubt in the back of her mind. What if they were right? What if these Deathworlders were more than just stories? What if the galaxy's most dangerous mercenaries had met their match and these humans' ship descended through the atmosphere of the planet? The landscape unfolding before them like an alien world, a twisted mix of jagged mountains, vast deserts, and wild jungles. No one had ever been able to truly chart the planet's surface. It was said that the environment itself was alive, ready to devour any who dared enter. But what made it worse was the fact that the Deathworlders didn't just survive in these conditions. They thrived. The Vanguard crew had no way of knowing where they would land, what dangers would greet them, or if they would even make it out alive. All they had was the hope that their skills would be enough to get them through. As the ship touched down, the mercenaries disembarked quickly, their boots hitting the harsh soil. The air was thick with humidity and the scent of decay. The ground beneath them seemed to tremble with an eerie energy. Every step they took seemed to awaken something deep within the planet itself. They moved cautiously, their weapons at the ready, eyes scanning every shadow, every movement, hoping for the best but preparing for the worst. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, tall and imposing, dressed in dark armor. The Deathworlder Special Forces had arrived. At first the crew didn't know what to make of it. The human before them looked no different from any other soldier they had fought in the past, except for one thing: the calm intensity in their eyes. They weren't afraid of anything, they weren't even worried. Their presence alone seemed to demand respect. The air around them seemed to crackle with authority. This wasn't just a soldier, it was a force of nature, something far beyond anything the mercenaries had encountered. The Deathworlder spoke in a deep, gravelly voice that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. "I am Captain Torn of the Deathworlder Special Forces," he said, his tone cold but not unfriendly. "You have come to our world expecting a challenge, but you are not prepared for what you will face here." The mercenaries stood frozen for a moment, unsure how to respond. This was the moment they had feared, the confrontation they had been dreading. But Captain Jackson was the first to break the silence, his voice strong. "We didn't come here to fight. We came here to do a job. We're not afraid of you or your planet." Captain Torn gave a slight nod. "I've heard the rumors about your crew," he said, "but rumors are just stories. They don't tell the truth about what happens when you face the reality of this world. The truth is, you're not ready to face what lies ahead." The mercenaries exchanged nervous glances, but no one spoke up. Torn turned and began to walk away, his boots crunching against the rough ground. "Follow me," he said without looking back. The crew hesitated, but they knew they had no choice. They had to follow. They had come this far, and there was no turning back now. As they walked through the dense jungle, the sounds of the alien world surrounded them, the growl of unseen creatures, the rustling of leaves, the far-off rumble of thunder above them in the sky. But it was the silence of their guide that unsettled them. The Deathworlder spoke little, but his presence was enough to make them feel as if they were being watched at all times. They followed him for what felt like hours, Though the time seemed to stretch on unnaturally, finally they reached a clearing, and there they saw it, the Deathworlder training camp. It was a place of brutal discipline where warriors honed their skills in the most unforgiving of environments. The mercenaries watched in awe as Deathworlders sparred with each other using techniques that defied logic and gravity. They were faster, stronger, and more skilled than anything the mercenaries had ever seen. This was not just combat. It was survival at its highest form. Captain Torin turned to face them, his expression unchanged. "This is what you will face if you dare to challenge us," he said calmly. "You may have weapons, but we have something far more deadly. We have the will to survive. We have the will to conquer. And that is what you will never understand." The mercenaries stood in silence, their confidence shaken to the core. They had come to this planet thinking they were the strongest in the galaxy, but now they realized they were nothing compared to these Deathworlders. They had heard the stories, but nothing could have prepared them for the truths. The crew turned to leave the clearing. They knew one thing for sure: this mission was no longer just a job, it was a fight for survival, and they were about to find out just how deadly the Deathworlders could truly be. The first contact Vanguard crew spent the following days adjusting to the brutal environment of the planet. Their bodies ached from the unfamiliar gravity and the intense heat that radiated from the sun. They barely slept as the constant sounds of alien creatures echoed through the night. Some of the mercenaries had experience with dangerous worlds, but nothing prepared them for the relentless ferocity of this one. Every time they tried to rest, something seemed to move in the shadows, or a distant roar would remind them of the life-threatening creatures roaming the landscape. They had all grown used to fighting, but here in this foreign world, they were just visitors struggling to survive like everyone else. The crew did their best to ignore the growing tension. They kept their weapons close, always alert, but something felt off. It was the silence of the Deathworlders. They rarely spoke, but their presence loomed over the mercenaries like a shadow, and the longer they stayed, the more it seemed like the world itself was watching them, as though it was waiting for them to make a mistake. Captain Torin had warned them that they weren't prepared to face the challenges of this world, and with each passing day the mercenaries began to understand exactly what he meant. They had never encountered anything like it. Captain Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that the Deathworlders knew something they didn't. It wasn't just the skills they had seen in training or the way they moved with such precision. It was the way they lived, how they adapted to the world without hesitation, without fear. It was as if they were born to fight in this hostile environment, and that thought alone made Jackson's stomach turn. These were not just warriors. They were products of the system so brutal and unforgiving that no other species could ever hope to match it. As he walked with Asha toward the clearing, where they were to meet with Captain Torin again, he couldn't help but wonder what they were truly walking into. This time they had already seen the training ground, but what else was there to this hidden strength of the Deathworlders? Was it just physical prowess, or was there something more, something deeper that no one had ever fully understood? Asha seemed lost in her thoughts too, as if she was sensing the same growing dread in the air. The planetscape was harsh and unforgiving, but the Deathworlders moved through it like they were one with the land, as if the dangers that surrounded them were no different from the air they breathed. It was that connection to the planet that set them apart from anyone Jackson had ever known. The mercenaries were used to fighting and surviving, but this was something entirely different. They weren't just surviving here, they were living in a way that no one else could even imagine. They had adapted to the planet in ways that went beyond training or technology. It was a way of life that no other species could replicate. When they finally reached the clearing, Captain Torin was waiting for them as usual, his expression unreadable. But this time there was something in his eyes, a kind of quiet respect, or maybe it was something else, something deeper. Jackson couldn't quite put his finger on it. Torin looked at them for a long moment before speaking. "You think you're prepared for what's to come, but you haven't even scratched the surface yet," he said, his voice low and steady. He gestured to the landscape around them. "This is what we live for. This world shapes us. It tests us in ways that no other planet could win. You fight here, you don't just fight the enemy, you fight the world itself." Jackson was about to respond, but Torin raised a hand silencing him. Without a word he turned and motioned for the crew to follow them through the dense jungle. The air grew thick with humidity, and the sounds of alien creatures were louder now. The mercenaries kept closed, their eyes scanning for any sign of movement. They could feel the presence of the Deathworlders around them like a silent force that was always watching, ready to strike at any moment. The journey was long and harsh, the terrain was unforgiving, and the weather seemed to grow worse with each passing hour. It was clear that the Deathworlders were not just surviving, they were thriving in this chaos. They had learned to live with the planet in a way the mercenaries never called. Eventually, they arrived at a high plateau overlooking a vast canyon. Where the Deathworlders trained further, the mercenaries were taken to a high vantage point where they could see the full extent of the Special Forces operations. What they witnessed was unlike anything they had ever seen before. A group of Deathworlders moved. With the precision of a single organism, they worked together as if they were one mind, operating in perfect harmony. They crossed the treacherous terrain with ease, scaling cliffs and jumping from rock to rock while carrying heavy equipment, all while under constant attack from the planet's wildlife. The mercenaries watched in awe as these soldiers navigated through dangers that would have killed anyone else within minutes. They didn't just fight the creatures, they used them to their advantage, turning the hostile environment into a weapon against itself. Jackson felt a cold chill run down his spine. This was something different. These soldiers weren't just good at fighting, they understood their environment on a level that no one else could. They had learned to bend the planet's brutal forces to their will. And now the mercenaries were seeing the full extent of that power. It wasn't about being the toughest or the strongest, it was about surviving at all costs and using every advantage the planet gave them to stay alive. Captain Torrin turned to face them, his eyes sharp. "This is what you face when you face us," he said, his voice carrying an edge. "You've spent your lives fighting for profit, but here we fight for something more. We fight for our survival, we fight for our people, and we fight because we know there's nothing that can stop us, not the planet, not the creatures, and certainly not you." The words hit harder than any physical blow. The mercenaries were not prepared for this. They had come thinking they could handle whatever came their way, but now they saw the truth. They weren't just fighting a force of nature. They were fighting a force that had learned to become part of it. They were facing a species that had grown stronger, not just through technology or weapons, but through an understanding of the world itself that no one else had ever come close to mastering. The Deathworlders didn't just survive, they owned their survival, and that was a power the mercenaries couldn't even comprehend. Jackson stood there stunned as Torrin's words echoed in his mind. They had come here for a job, but now it seemed that the true challenge wasn't just to defeat the Deathworlders, it was to survive against them, to become something greater than they had ever imagined was possible. And suddenly Jackson wasn't sure if they could make it out of this alive. A battle like no other. Days blurred into one another as the crew of the Vanguard tried to adjust to their new reality on the hostile planet. The harsh climate, the unpredictable terrain, and the constant threat of deadly creatures lurking in the shadows all made every moment feel like a battle for survival. The crew could barely sleep anymore. The night was alive with the sounds of the planet's predators, and every rustle of the wind could be a signal of danger. They had survived previous encounters, but this was different. This planet wasn't just dangerous, it was alive in a way no one could truly understand. And the Deathworlders weren't just a force of nature, they were its masters. They had learned to harness the planet's every deadly secret and use it against anyone who dared to challenge them. Captain Jackson couldn't sleep, his mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead. They had seen the Deathworlders fight and survive the impossible, but now they would have to face them in battle, and he wasn't sure they were prepared for what was coming. The Vanguard crew had fought against powerful enemies before, but nothing had prepared them for this. They weren't just fighting soldiers, they were fighting a culture, a way of life that had been forged in the fires of this planet's brutal conditions. And Jackson couldn't help but wonder how far the Deathworlders were willing to go to protect their land, their people, and their way of life. Commander Asha stood beside him, her eyes scanning the horizon. As they waited for the Deathworlder special forces to arrive, she knew this would be different than any fight they had faced before. The Deathworlders weren't afraid of the planet or its creatures. They didn't just survive, they thrived in the chaos. And for a moment she felt the weight of what they had taken on. They had come here thinking they could defeat any enemy that stood in their way, but now they were questioning their own survival. And as the wind howled around them and the sky turned a darker shade of purple, she knew that they were walking into something far beyond anything they could have imagined. The battle began at dawn. The mercenaries took their positions around the perimeter of the clearing, their weapons ready, their minds focused. They had trained for this, they had fought through countless wars and faced endless odds, but the feeling in the air was different. This time there was no confidence, no arrogance, just a cold determination to survive. They knew the Deathworlders wouldn't hold back, they would come at them with everything they had, and the mercenaries had to be ready for it. Suddenly the first attack came, a blur of movement in the distance, and then the ground beneath them shook as a massive creature charged forward, its claws slashing the air as it came toward them. The mercenaries fired their weapons instinctively, but the creature was fast. Their shots missed as it leaped through the air with terrifying speed and landed in the center of their formation. It roared, shaking the earth around them, and before anyone could react, it was upon them. The mercenaries fought back with everything they had, but the creature was like nothing they had ever faced. Its skin was tough like armor, its claws sharp enough to tear through metal, and its strength was beyond anything the mercenaries had ever experienced. They managed to land a few shots, but the creature seemed unfazed by the attack. It swung its claws, tearing through the group and sending mercenaries flying through the air. It was pure chaos, the air thick with gunfire, the sounds of weapons firing and creatures screeching in the distance. Jackson found himself in the middle of the battle, fighting alongside his crew. He could barely see through the smoke and dust that filled the air, but he could hear the growls of the creatures, the shouts of his crew, and the screeching of metal as it bent and snapped under the pressure. The battle was like nothing he had ever known. It wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a test of their very will to exist in this hellish world. And for a moment Jackson wondered if they were outmatched, outclassed in every way. But then something unexpected happened in the middle of the chaos. The Deathworlders appeared. Their movements were fluid and effortless. As they emerged from the shadows like ghosts, they seemed to move as one, their coordination flawless and their weapons precise. They were no longer just soldiers. They were a force of nature in themselves. Their speed was unmatched, their agility mind-blowing. And in that moment Jackson realized they were not fighting against soldiers, they were fighting against a species that had become a part of their environment, that had adapted to it in a way that no one else ever could. The Deathworlders didn't waste time with fancy tactics or distractions. They went straight for the kill, their weapons cutting through the creatures with surgical precision. They didn't hesitate, they didn't stop to think, they just moved with purpose and efficiency, cutting through the enemy like a blade through soft tissue. The mercenaries fought alongside them, but it was clear that the Deathworlders were the true masters of this world. Jackson watched as one of the Deathworlders moved effortlessly through the battlefield, their weapon flashing as they struck down enemies with a single blow, their eyes cold and focused on the task at hand. Nothing seemed to faze them, nothing slowed them down. It was as if they were born for this. They didn't just fight the creatures, they controlled the battlefield. They moved through the chaos like it was their home. And the mercenaries were nothing more than visitors lost in a world that didn't care if they survived or not. For the first time in his life, Jackson felt a deep sense of fear. It wasn't the fear of dying, it was the fear of realizing that they were not the strongest force in the galaxy, that there was something more primal, more unforgiving than anything they had faced before. And as the battle raged on, the Deathworlders showed them just how much power they had over their environment, over their enemies, and even over their own. Fatigued mercenaries fought with everything they had, but as the battle continued it became clear that they couldn't keep up with the Deathworlders, not in their own environment, not in a world where survival was a way of life. The mercenaries had their weapons and their training, but they didn't have the one thing the Deathworlders had: the ability to adapt and thrive in a world that no one else could even begin to understand. As the battle finally came to an end, the mercenaries were left standing among the wreckage of the creatures and the remnants of the battlefield. The Deathworlders stood silently around them, their expressions unreadable. But there was something in the air, something unspoken, that made Jackson realize they had just witnessed something that no one else had ever seen before. This wasn't just a battle. It was a lesson in survival, a reminder of what it meant to be truly unstoppable. And in that moment Jackson knew that the Vanguard crew had been humbled. They had come to this planet thinking they were the most dangerous force in the galaxy. But now they knew the truth. They were just a small part of a much larger and much more dangerous world, a world that would never truly be conquered, and a species that would never be defeated. Fear takes root. The Vanguard crew had never known fear like this before. In all their years as mercenaries, they had fought through the most hostile environments, faced overwhelming odds, and taken on enemies that others dared not even look at. Yet none of it had prepared them for the cold realization that had settled in their hearts after the battle with the Deathworlders. It was not the ferocity of the creatures or the dangers of the planet that had shaken them to their core. It was the undeniable truth that the Deathworlders were not just soldiers, they were survivors. They were not afraid of the planet's deadly creatures or the harsh conditions of their world. They had become one with it, and in doing so, they had gained a power that no one else could ever match. The mercenaries had trained for years to fight and survive, but they had never trained to live in such a place. They had never trained to become part of a world so unforgiving and relentless. The Deathworlders had a connection to this planet that ran deeper than blood, deeper than any training they had ever undergone, and it was that connection that had left the mercenaries feeling small and powerless. They had faced many enemies before, but none like this, none that could make them feel so insignificant in the grand scheme of the universe. Captain Jackson sat in the command center of the Vanguard, staring out the viewport at the distant horizon. The landscape was still wild and untamed, but the view had lost its allure. The planet that had once seemed like just another job now felt like a trap, a place where the very air seemed to be conspiring against them. The wind howled through the cracks in the ship's hull, as if reminding them that they were not in control here. They were merely guests in a world that would consume them. Without hesitation, his fingers tapped nervously against the metal surface of the table as the silence hung thick in the air. The crew had gathered for their daily briefing, but no one spoke. No one seemed to know what to say. After the battle they had just witnessed, they had survived, yes, but at what cost? How much longer could they endure this world's brutal challenges without being consumed by it? They had come here thinking they could conquer the Deathworlders, thinking they could take the job and walk away with a victory, but now they were starting to see that they were out of their depth. They were not just facing soldiers, they were facing a force of nature, and that was a fight they had no chance of winning. Commander Asha stood beside him, her arms crossed as she surveyed the room. The mercenaries were all there, their faces worn with exhaustion and uncertainty. They had been through hell, but the real battle had only just begun. She could feel the weight of their fear hanging over them. It was the kind of fear that came not from facing death, but from the knowledge that they were fighting something they could never truly understand, something that was beyond their control. She glanced at Jackson, knowing he was thinking the same thing. This was no longer just a job for them. This was a test of their very survival. We'll have to face the truth, she said, breaking the silence. The Deathworlders aren't just soldiers, they're part of this planet. They've adapted to it in a way no one else ever could. They don't just survive here, they thrive here, and we're not equipped for that. We never have been. We've been so used to fighting for money, for glory. But this is different. This is something we've never encountered before. Jackson nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. We've been operating under the assumption that we could beat them, that we could outfight them, that we could win just by being better trained or better armed. But what if it's not about being better at all? What if it's about living in a place like this? What if it's about becoming something different altogether? He paused, letting the words sink in. We've underestimated them, and now we're paying the price. The crew sat in silence as the weight of their situation became clear. They had been hired to fight for a wealthy client, but they were quickly realizing that the true battle wasn't about money or resources. It was about survival. It was about adapting to a world that was designed to destroy them, and every moment they spent here they were reminded of how small and fragile they truly were in the face of the Deathworlders and their unyielding will to survive. They had fought wars and defeated armies, but this was something else entirely. This was a world that didn't care about their weapons or their tactics. It didn't care about their training or their experience. All it cared about was whether they could adapt or die, and the Deathworlders had already proven they could do that far better than anyone else. As the days wore on, the crew began to feel the weight of their fear pressing down on them. They tried to continue with their mission as best they could, but the fear lingered in the back of their minds. It wasn't the fear of dying, but the fear of realizing that they couldn't win no matter how hard they tried. No matter how many battles they fought, the Deathworlders were always one step ahead of them, always one step closer to mastering the planet's brutal challenges. And the mercenaries were starting to realize that they didn't have the answers. They had come here thinking they were the masters of their fate, but now they knew the truth. They were just another group of soldiers on a planet that didn't care about them, that would swallow them whole if they weren't careful. Jackson and Asha sat together in the quiet of the command center as the rest of the crew carried on with their tasks. The tension in the room was palpable. They all knew what was at stake. They all knew that their survival depended on their ability to adapt to the world around them. But the question was, could they learn to live in a place like this? Or would they become just another casualty of a planet that had been designed to destroy them? Thought was chilling, but as Jackson looked around the room at the faces of his crew, he knew that they had no choice but to keep going. No matter how much they feared the Deathworlders or the planet, they had to keep moving forward. They had to face the truth. They weren't just fighting for money anymore. They were fighting for their lives, and if they didn't find a way to adapt, they wouldn't just lose the job, they would lose everything. Fear was real. It was growing stronger with each passing day, and Jackson knew that if they didn't find a way to face it head on, they wouldn't make it out of here alive. But there was one thing he had learned through all his years as a mercenary: fear wasn't something to run from. It was something to use, something to fuel them to fight harder, to survive longer. And if the mercenaries had any hope of surviving this world, they had to start thinking like the Deathworlders. They had to start thinking like survive or last stand. Days on the planet stretched endlessly for the Vanguard crew. They had grown accustomed to the unrelenting heat, the harsh winds, and the constant barrage of alien creatures that seemed to rise out of the very ground beneath their feet. But what they could never grow used to was the crushing weight of fear that seemed to have taken hold of them. No matter how hard they tried to fight it, The realization that they were facing something beyond their ability to control had set in. The Deathworlders had proven to be everything they had feared, and more, their strength, their will to survive, their ability to navigate and conquer this unforgiving world had left the mercenaries shaken to their core. They had come here to do a job, but now it felt like they were trapped in a nightmare that they might never wake up from. Captain Jackson sat alone in his quarters, staring out at the alien sky that stretched endlessly before him. He had always prided himself on his ability to lead his crew through any challenge, no matter how impossible it seemed. But now he felt powerless. He could hear the faint sound of footsteps outside his door, but it didn't matter. He felt distant from everything around him. Everything felt surreal, like they were no longer in control of their fate, like they were nothing more than pawns in a game they didn't understand. The fear that had once been a distant shadow had now become a constant presence, always looming, always watching, always reminding them that they weren't as invincible as they had once believed. He looked at his hands, trembling slightly, his body worn from days of constant battle and fear. But it was the fear in his heart that weighed heaviest. It wasn't the fear of dying, it was the fear of knowing that they had underestimated the Deathworlders, and now they were paying the price for their arrogance. Sisha entered the room without knocking. Her expression was grave and tired, but there was a fire in her eyes, a fire that Jackson hadn't seen in a long time. "We need to talk," she said, sitting down beside him. "The time for hesitation is over. We can't keep running from this. We have to face the reality of what we're up against. We've been trained to fight, but we've never been trained to survive in a world like this. We've seen the Deathworlders live in this nightmare and thrive, but we're not like them. We can't survive here on sheer will alone." Jackson looked at her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know we're not like them, but that's not the problem. The problem is we don't know how to fight them, not in this environment, not in their world." He ran a hand through his hair, his frustration mounting. "We came here thinking we were the ones in control, but now we see that we're nothing but visitors on a planet that doesn't want us here. And the Deathworlders, they're part of it. They've become one with it, and we're the outsiders. We're the ones who are weak." Kasha shook her head. "No, we're not weak," she said, her voice firm. "We've survived on dozens of planets. We've faced impossible odds and come out on top. We're not weak, we're just unprepared. This is a different kind of fight, and it's going to take everything. We have to win it. But we can't give up now. We have to push back. We have to show the Deathworlders that we're not going to let them break us." Jackson stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the darkened landscape below them. The ground was lit by flashes of distant lightning. The storm had begun to brew again, as it always did on this planet. The air felt heavy with the promise of more chaos, but in that chaos there was a strange sort of clarity. They had come here thinking they could conquer. They had come here thinking they were the strongest, but now they had to face the truth. They had been humbled in ways they had never imagined. The Deathworlders had shown them what true survival meant, and now it was time to stop running from that reality. It was time to face the planet and the Deathworlders head on. "We don't have much time," he said, turning to face Asha. "The storm is coming, and we're going to have to fight our way through it. But this time, we're not just fighting for survival. We're fighting to prove that we belong here too. We might not have the connection to this planet that the Deathworlders do, but we have something they don't. We have the will to survive, and that's something they can't take from you." Sasha nodded, her eyes blazing with determination. "We fight together," she said. "We make our stand here. We show them what we're made of." The crew gathered in the command center, their faces grim but resolute. They knew what was coming, and they knew they had no choice but to face it together. They had spent so much time running from the truth, but now they had no other option but to stand and fight. Captain Jackson stood before them, his expression firm as he addressed his crew. "This is it," he said, "the last chance. We have to prove ourselves. We've faced every kind of enemy out there, but the Deathworlders, they're different. They've shown us that there's more to surviving than just fighting, and we've learned from them. Now it's time to use that knowledge to our advantage. They may have the home field advantage, but we have something they don't. We have each other. We have the strength of this crew, and that's something they'll never be able to take away from us." Letters. The crew prepared for the final battle. The air was thick with tension. They knew that they were walking into the heart of the storm, but this time they weren't afraid. They had learned to adapt. They had learned to survive, and now they would show the Deathworlders that they were more than just mercenaries. They were a force to be reckoned with. They knew the risks. They knew the odds were against them, but they also knew that they weren't going to give up. They would fight until their last breath. They would face the Deathworlders and the planet's brutal forces, and they would prove that they could survive in this world just like everyone else. As they moved out into the open, the wind howled around them and the storm intensified. It was a fight unlike any they had ever known. The Deathworlders were relentless, their attacks swift and brutal, But this time the mercenaries were ready. They moved as one, a well-oiled machine. Their training kicking in as they fought back with everything they had. They used the terrain to their advantage just as the Deathworlders had done. But they were no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting for respect, fighting to prove that they too could master this harsh world, fighting to show the Deathworlders that they were not just visitors, they were warriors in their own right. And no matter how fierce the storm was, they would face it together and they would win. A reluctant respect storm raged above them, lightning flashing across the darkened sky, the sound of thunder deafening as the mercenaries and Deathworlders faced off in the heart of the planet's wilderness. The air crackled with tension, heavy with the anticipation of what was to come. The Vanguard crew had fought their way through impossible odds to get this far, and now they stood at the brink of their final confrontation. They had come to this world thinking they were the dominant force in the galaxy, but the Deathworlders had shown them the truth. They were nothing more than visitors on a planet that belonged to the humans who had learned to survive, to adapt, and to conquer. Captain Jackson's mind raced as he surveyed the battlefield, his eyes scanning the enemy positions, his thoughts clear and focused. For the first time since their arrival, they had fought for their survival, yes, but now they were fighting for something greater. They were fighting not just to win this battle, but to prove to themselves that they were more than the sum of their weapons, their training, or their history. They were fighting for their right to stand alongside the Deathworlders, to earn their place in this unforgiving galaxy, and to show that they could not be beaten. The Deathworlders had seen them as nothing more than a passing challenge at first, a group of mercenaries who would fade into oblivion after one failed attempt to outsmart them. But now, after days of relentless combat, the Deathworlders were starting to see something they hadn't expected: resilience. They hadn't expected the Vanguard crew to keep pushing forward despite the impossible odds, despite the ever-present danger, despite the truth that they were fighting on the Deathworlders' home turf. Asha stood by Jackson's side, her expression unwavering as she prepared for the final push. She could feel the eyes of the Deathworlders on them, and it made her uneasy. But there was also something else there, a quiet respect. The battle had shifted. The Deathworlders no longer looked at them as prey or as weak outsiders. They had come to understand that the mercenaries were different from what they had expected. They weren't simply there to fight for money or glory. They were there because they wanted to survive. They were there because they had no other choice but to adapt and conquer. Jackson turned to face his crew, his voice steady, though there was a hint of something deeper, something far more human in his tone than he had ever shown before. "We've come a long way," he said, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the men and women who had stood with him through every battle, every trial, and every danger. "None of us thought we'd make it this far, but here we are, and now we show them that we won't back down. We fight together, we fight as one, and we show them that we belong here, on this planet. We don't just survive, we thrive." Asha gave him a firm nod. "They respect us now," she said, her voice low but resolute, "not just because we've fought well, but because we've learned to live with the planet's dangers. We've earned the right to fight with them, and now we take this last step, together." As the storm surged around them, the mercenaries moved forward, their weapons raised, their resolve stronger than ever before. The Deathworlders stood waiting, their eyes sharp, their postures relaxed but ready. The tension between the two forces had reached its peak, and for the first time, both sides understood that this wasn't just about who was the strongest. This was about proving their place in the universe, their ability to endure, to adapt, and to come out on top despite the odds. The battle that ensued was unlike anything the Vanguard crew had ever faced. It was no longer a fight for survival, it was a test of their very willpower, a contest of who could outlast the other. The Deathworlders were relentless, their movements calculated and precise, using their knowledge of the terrain to strike with terrifying speed and accuracy. But the mercenaries had learned from them, had adapted to the brutal planet, and they fought with a ferocity that surprised even themselves. In the midst of the chaos, Jackson found himself facing off against Captain Torrin, the leader of the Deathworlder Special Forces. The two stood locked in combat, their weapons clashing, their muscles straining with every movement. Jackson's heart raced as he realized that this wasn't just another fight. This was the culmination of everything they had been through, everything they had learned on this planet. This was their moment to prove that they could survive, that they could stand tall beside the Deathworlders and earn their respect. Torrin's eyes locked onto his, the two men staring each other down as their weapons met with a clash that sent sparks flying. Torrin's voice was low, almost a growl. "You fight well," he said, a rare note of admiration in his voice. "But you're still a long way from being like us." Jackson gritted his teeth, pushing forward with all his strength. "Maybe," he said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion in his body. "But we've learned, we've adapted, and we're not going anywhere." The battle raged on, both sides fighting with everything they had. The Vanguard crew had fought to prove themselves, to show that they could survive in this hostile world, and now they were doing it. They weren't just mercenaries anymore. They had become something more. They had become survivors. They had become warriors worthy of standing beside the Deathworlders. When the dust finally settled, and the battle came to an end, the mercenaries stood victorious. They had survived. They had earned their place in this harsh world, and as the storm cleared, they looked around at the Deathworlders, who now regarded them with a reluctant respect. The battle had been hard, but in the end, it was not just about who had the better weapons or the stronger warriors. It was about who could endure, who could adapt, and who could rise above the challenges that the universe threw at them. Captain Torrin approached Jackson, his expression unreadable but his eyes betraying something else, something that had not been there before. He extended his hand, a silent acknowledgement of the struggle they had both endured. "You've earned your place," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of truth. "You fought with honor. You fought with the spirit of a Deathworlder, and for that, you have my respect." Jackson took his hand, a small but meaningful smile crossing his face. "Thank you," he said, his voice strong, though it held the weight of all they had been through. "But it's not just about respect, it's about surviving together." As the mercenaries and Deathworlders stood side by side, the sun began to rise over the horizon, casting a golden light over the battlefield. They had faced the impossible, and they had conquered it. They had earned their place in this harsh world, and in doing so, they had found something more valuable than victory. They had found respect, and that respect would carry them forward, wherever their journey took them next. The legacy of the Deathworlder's sun rose higher in the sky as the battlefields were left in the quiet aftermath of victory. The storm had passed, and with it a sense of calm settled over the land for the first time in days. The Vanguard crew stood amidst the wreckage of their battle, both sides breathing heavily, feeling the weight of their actions. The dust that had settled now seemed to carry the weight of something greater, something that could not easily be erased. The mercenaries had survived against overwhelming odds, but it wasn't just the physical battle that had marked this victory. It was the realization that they had crossed a line. They had entered a world they had no right to claim, and yet they had fought for their place, and in the end they had earned Itas. The last of the creatures were driven off, and the Deathworlders stood in quiet observation. Jackson felt the presence of something that had once seemed distant: respect from their enemies. But it wasn't just respect, it was acknowledgement. They had been tested beyond anything they could have imagined. They had been pushed to their limits and forced to adapt to a world that had no mercy, but in doing so, they had earned the right to stand beside the Deathworlders, not as conquerors, but as equals. The Deathworlders had watched them fight with everything they had witnessed their struggle, and now there was something unspoken between them, a bond formed not by words, but by the shared experience of survival and sacrifice. Sisha stood beside Jackson, her eyes scanning the horizon as she took in the stillness that had descended over the battlefield. She could feel the change in the air, the shift from fear to something more powerful, something that had been born in the heart of the storm. They had come to this planet as mercenaries hoping for wealth and glory, but they had found something far greater. They had found purpose. They had found their place among the stars. They had found the will to survive, the unyielding drive to live even in the most hostile of environments. And that was something no one could take from them. Jackson turned to face the Deathworlders, who stood in the distance, their figures outlined against the rising sun. He had learned much from them over the past few days, learned that survival wasn't just about strength, it was about resilience. It was about living in a world that could kill you in an instant and still choosing to rise again, choosing to face the next challenge head on and keep going no matter how impossible it seemed. The Deathworlders were more than just soldiers, they were survivors in the truest sense of the word. And now Jackson and his crew had become a part of that legacy. As he watched Captain Torrin approach with the same solemn expression he had worn throughout the battle, Jackson knew that this moment would stay with him for the rest of his life. The Deathworlder leader extended his hand once again in a silent gesture of respect. This time, there was no need for words, no need for explanations. They both understood the weight of what had transpired. They had fought not just for survival, but for something more, for the right to exist in a world that didn't care about them, for the right to prove they could adapt and overcome the impossible. Ajan shook his hand firmly, knowing that this was the end of one chapter, and the beginning of another. They had survived, they had proven themselves, and now they had earned the respect of the galaxy's deadliest warriors. The Deathworlders would always remain a powerful force in the universe, but so too would the mercenaries who had dared to challenge them, who had refused to back down when the odds were stacked against the Moss. The Vanguard crew boarded their ship for the journey home. They knew that their story would live on, not just as another tale of survival, but as a testament to the strength of the human spirit. The Deathworlders had shown them the value of resilience, the value of never giving up no matter how bleak the situation seemed. And now the mercenaries would carry that lesson with them as they traveled across the stars. They would remember the battle, the hardship, the fear, but most of all they would remember the respect they had earned, not just from their enemies, but from themselves. They had become something greater than they had ever imagined. And as the ship lifted off from the planet's surface, leaving the stormy skies behind them, they knew that no matter where they went next, they would always carry the legacy of the Deathworlders within them. And as the ship disappeared into the vastness of space, the words of Captain Torin echoed in their minds, "You have earned your place here." And they knew deep down that it wasn't just a victory in a battle. It was the victory of survival. It was the victory of being human. It was the victory of never giving up no matter what the universe threw at them. And for that, they would always stand tall no matter where they went next. And